Can you quantify your technique? Lots of coaches and scientists in sport are often trying to quantify things, and there's good reason for this. It's often said in different fields of science or engineering or even business that what gets measured gets managed. However, there is also another famous saying, which is that not everything that counts can be counted. Measuring climbing technique is not a straightforward issue, and in this episode I'm going to explore this and try to offer some take-home points about how you might improve the rate of your technical learning. What I'd like to do is introduce a very simple idea about structure for how to think about technique that I've found useful in trying to learn it myself. Many other sports lend themselves to a reasonable degree to measuring and monitoring metrics, but technical sports like climbing present much more of a problem. If I do the move like this or like that, which is better and by how much is it better? Technique is so central to performance in climbing, but can you even measure it at all? And if so, how would you quantify it? With some difficulty, I would say. And given that difficulty, how important is it to even try? Well, pretty important, and some really simple observations can be pivotal in directing your improvement. For example, you might have noticed that on a fingerboard or a campus board, you are stronger than climber X or Y, and yet they climb harder grades than you. And if that's the case, then you might have a clue that technique might be a weak area that's holding you back. In this situation, other more easily quantifiable measures, in this case finger strength and overall climbing grade, can indirectly tell you about something about technique. You are in effect triangulating from those measures in order to make an inference about technique that is really useful and worth making. The classic endurance sports like running or cycling or cross-country skiing lend themselves rather better to measurement, and they are way less technical than rock climbing is. But even sports that have a strong technical element usually have a set of core movement patterns that have common movement errors which can be identified and fixed. They're like systematic errors, and you can think of things like a swimming stroke or kicking a ball or a golf swing or a tennis serve. In climbing, we obviously have a set of characteristic moves like rollovers and drop knees, but within those broad categories of move, there really is a lot of variability about how we make the moves, obviously based on the layout and the character of the holds, and also the characteristics of our own bodies. And this is why it's so common in climbing for even a tiny change in something like a finger or a foot position, or the speed of the execution of the move makes it far, far easier to do. And so the infinite variety of movement dictated by the rock makes it pretty challenging, to say the least, to model climbing technique and to make inferences about it. There are many basic technical errors though, and in fact in just a minute I'm going to make another video about one which I hypothesize as being possibly the most common, and do subscribe to my channel to see that if you haven't done already. Even if you have two climbers who do exactly the same move, how do we go about saying that one climber is doing the move better than the other? They both have different bodies, and so you might argue that they never really can do the same move anyway, if you know what I mean. Really, to learn technique, I have always thought that the top level goal is to understand climbing, and I like an analogy with learning language. To me, movement technique in climbing is actually quite like a language. In spoken languages, there are many individual words to learn, and there are styles of how to connect them together into phrases, and there's also the broader styles of writing or presenting information. There are also multiple ways in language to communicate the same thing. These are like layers of technique in the use of language, and we have the same thing in movement technique in climbing, where there are multiple levels of technical skills, from the granular things like what angle to place your foot on a foothold to clusters of individual techniques that make up a whole move like a rollover. You could think of this as like a technical phrase, a little cluster of techniques that all go together in one wider technique. And then you've got the layer of the higher level stuff, like your general climbing style. Is it aggressive, or is it delicate, or precise, or gymnastic? So we've just thought through a little bit about what climbing technique actually is, and even just in doing that, I've outlined a bit of a structure for how you might break technique down into subcomponent parts and then start to think about them and attempt to figure out which ones might be a priority for you. And that's a good start. But once you go beyond that though and think, right, how do I actually get on the wall and learn those technical skills? It does get quite daunting because it's hard to measure. How do you get the feedback that's crucial for the practice to translate into understanding? In language, you might know that you're making progress if you know you're being understood. You must learn language by using language, and you learn climbing by doing climbing, but that's not the whole story. People who are the most skillful at using language generally read and listen a lot, but the correlation isn't perfect. There is something a bit more to it. You do have to analyse and think critically about how well language delivers its message in order to make use of all that reading experience. In climbing, succeeding or failing on a given move is a key source of feedback. But then that limits you to hard moves, and then maybe your ability to get through moves using strength might also confound that feedback. And therefore, the sense that a given move feels easier is perhaps the most important feedback that you have in order to learn technique. If you did it well, the move took less effort, and that signal, together with some insight on exactly what you did differently to make it feel easier, is what you really need. The ease of doing this in bouldering is why it's such a powerful tool for getting better at climbing, and if you're not doing it, then you really should consider it. Really technically proficient climbers have nearly always done a lot of climbing, but the best climber is not necessarily just the one who's done the most moves. Again, we need the combination of number of moves plus analysis for the learning progress to actually take place. So my process of learning technique is essentially a never-ending cycle of trying moves, trying to do them differently, and comparing the outcome. Was the move easier with the change, or was it not? And also then doing the same by watching other climbers and trying to learn from the way they move, and experimenting with mimicking their movement in my own movement patterns and seeing if that works better for my body. This process requires a lot of concentration and engagement, as well as a lot of time and a lot of consistency, the most important word in training. But that's not actually the point that I want to make in this video. The idea that I'd like to present relates to something that can be quite confusing when watching other climbers. So I'm going to paint a picture of two opposite phenotypes of climbers that you might see at the crag or at the climbing wall. If you watch other climbers, then you can quite quickly get a rough measure of their attributes, and a subset of them will be very physically strong, i.e. you'll see them hanging one-armed from the fingerboard, maybe even holding a weight in their other hand, and yet they are not as good on the actual climbing as other climbers who are a bit physically weaker. And perhaps confusingly, when you watch those strong but underachieving climbers, they still look smooth and controlled in their movements. So can we actually say that they have poor technique relative to their strength? If they did, wouldn't that show in their climbing? Surely if they had poor technique, we would see their feet slipping, or getting tangled up in sequences, or missing holds, or generally falling off without any warning. And I would argue no, because that's not the only marker of poor technique. In my view, the poor technique that lets these climbers down is there, but it's not obvious. The techniques they do have, they can execute very well. You might even hypothesize that they execute their moves well, precisely because they have a relatively limited technical repertoire or imagination. There are just fewer techniques for them to practice and get good at. Conversely, you might see very technically proficient climbers who excel at climbing and have a high climbing grade relative to their physical strength, and they might actually display visible technical errors. Broadly speaking, their climbing might look kind of messy, and yet it also seems to work for them, and I can think of a few famous examples off the top of my head. They might have the opposite issue in that they have a very large technical repertoire, and they are the ones who are going to find that killer toe hook or hand swap that you would just never have thought of. But it's also possible that they don't execute the moves in their repertoire with all that much precision. Although the goal then is to increase the number of techniques that you have in your repertoire, I still think you'll find it very difficult to actually count them, and I'm unsure of whether it's actually even worth trying. My approach is just to keep trying to notice if I'm good or bad relative to other climbers at each technique, and just noting that gives you a signal that there's still more to be learned in one given area of your technique. And when you're comparing to those other climbers, remember to take their strength into account. Also, always beware of the population that you actually compare yourself to. If you compare yourself to a cohort of climbers who focus a lot of time and energy to improving finger strength, are these climbers normal, or could they represent a cohort who's already skewed towards limited technical ability? Maybe not, but it's important to ask the question and answer it. So it might not be achievable to reach a very precise measuring of technical progress. Perhaps the best you're going to be able to say is that you're poor or adequate or good at a given move or technique, but you can go a long way with just that information. And if you get an objective opinion from a technical coach or mentor, then you can access that feedback at a much higher rate. Coaching for the strength and conditioning aspect of climbing has got quite popular in recent years, and that's a great thing. But if you can find a good technical mentor, that really is like gold dust. So the question in your everyday climbing is, can you both broaden your climbing techniques, i.e. add more techniques to your repertoire, as well as deepen your technique, i.e. improve the skill level or precision with which you execute the techniques within that repertoire? I find that just thinking about technique in this way helps me to see more clearly where the areas of weakness lie and therefore make more progress per unit time of training. So I guess my approach to technique training does have a broad structure to it. I still don't go too much further than this because I don't really have the ability to. I don't have a way of defining perfect technique or of counting techniques, and therefore I don't really try to. Okay, I suppose this episode has been quite a conceptual one, and in another I'll go through much more practical pros and cons of different types of climbing and training sessions and venues for actually learning technique. But I hope you found this idea useful, and we'll see you in the next episode if you're subscribed to the channel.